So let me begin by thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak here. I'll be talking about predicting catastrophic breakdowns in various systems. So, and that by using machine learning algorithm. So fractures happen in, or fracture and breakdown happens in various length scales, starting from the laboratory scale of a few millimeters to even the tectonic scale of a few tens of kilometers. And they are all essentially disordered systems that are driven outside of their linear elastic regime. So if you have some kind of a generic force displacement diagram, you will obviously start with a linear part, and then you will have several jumps, which are essentially failures that has occurred in various parts of the system. And you could end up with a time series, so you could detect those emissions, generally acoustic emissions, and you end up with a time series like this. So these are the energies emitted at various time steps, and this is the time. So as I said, this can happen in various types of system and various scales. So this is an actual time, how an actual time series looks like. This is actually an experiment of a porous rock. So at different times, you have this seemingly irregular pattern. Now, these patterns are not fully regular. So just one simple thing is that if you take their size distribution, you will find that they are scale-free size distribution. So in a straight line in a log-log plot. So this is something like a crackling noise or, yeah, that sort of intermittency. So although there is a constant and steady drive in the system, the response of the system is scale-free in the sense that it has various, so there is no special energy scale associated with it. So there are other regularities with these systems. So this is only in dynamics, so you could have static features, for example, the roughness of fracture fronts or waiting time distributions and so on. So this is actually one example of such universality. So this is an experiment in the porous rock, as I said, and this is the California data catalog. So that's a vastly different length and energy scales, but they have similarly behaved responses. So the basic motivation for applying the statistical physics approach in these sort of problems usually is that there are power law scaling of physical quantities, and the exponents that we get, I mean, I have only shown one example, there are plenty of others, that are universal and largely independent of the details of the system. So the hope is that there could be some generic models that could capture the essential properties of these failure processes. However, the aim today is to see if machine learning algorithm can predict such kind of failure. And the reason I mentioned the model is that obviously this would be useful to train the algorithms using models if the models can capture the failure properties. So just one slide summary of a machine learning algorithm would be that, well, in a traditional programming, you have data and program fed into a computer that gives you the output. And in machine learning, you have the data and output fed into a computer that gives you the program. Well, I mean, the thing is that, let's say you want to do some kind of a classification sort of thing, and then you have your data, which is the training data, and then you know the classification. So since you are training the algorithm, then computer goes through the process of meticulously devising an algorithm that could actually correctly characterize your training data and then come up with a scheme. And then that scheme would be used in case of the test data, which is not seen by the algorithm. And then the performance of the sorting then would be the performance of your scheme. So that's roughly what machine learning does. And the thing that we are using is a random forest algorithm. Again, I don't have time to go into details of it. The random forest is an ensemble of decision trees, and decision trees are things like that. So you have a question, you could have a couple of answers. Depending on that answer, you can ask some other questions. But at the end, you would have some decision nodes. So these are called the leaves. So depending upon, so you could specify what would be the depth of your tree and so on. So at the end, what you have is, let's say, something like this, that you have a 2D plane and you have 3 colors, and these are your various sets of data. But by looking at it, you roughly know that on the top left would be the blue, top right would be red, and bottom right would be green. So that's something like that you come up with from the training set. So if this is the training set, and these your points are your tests, and you see the green points are mostly in the green regime, blue points are in blue regime, red point in red regime, except for some errors. So that's your performance of the algorithm. So very roughly speaking, with two variable case, obviously you can have tens of variables and so on. So roughly this is what happens in random forest. Now the question is whether how do they work for predicting an imminent breakdown in fracture. So the system we are looking at is a creep rupture in shear. So this is again all simulation. So this is a 2D sample, and you have a constant shear that is far less than the failure point, but you have a creep, so you have thermal noise into it, and therefore although you have initial breakdown that are quite random, eventually it localizes into a shear plane. So if you look at the time sequence, so these gray things, these are the energy emissions that I started with, and at some point, so these are all scaled by the failure time. So at 1, it basically fails. So this is a strain rate, how it varies. So this is a system. Now you feed this into a machine learning algorithm, and your job is to predict if you are far away from this. So this is your failure point. So let's say, could you predict right about here, which is about 40%, let's say, and that you are this much away from failure. So that's basically the question one likes to answer. So this is the result. So first, let us look at this. This is a plot of the actual failure time and the predicted time by the algorithm. So this is just one example. You see that when you are, so this is how the failure is approached. So this 0, 0 corner is the failure point. So if you're far away from it, the prediction is not that good. But as the time of failure is increased, the prediction becomes better. So the more diagonal this matrix is, the better is your prediction. And here you have various things. So you could always have a prediction without using machine learning. So one naive prediction of everything is like that the next event is the average of all events that has happened before. So that's just a naive prediction. So that's without machine learning. Obviously, that doesn't do much well. So you see there are lots of errors in that. But using machine learning, you start not so well, but eventually your prediction matches your failure point very nicely. So you could quantify this with some kind of a fractional error, and again T by TF. So this is your naive prediction that doesn't improve with time, but this is your machine learning prediction that improves with time. These are for various stress values, and there is no significant dependence on stress values. However, if you have various strength of disorder in your system, so for anyone who's interested, this is the Weibull parameter, which is the failure points of your of the sheared material that I took. So now all these subsequent figures are scaled by this sort of average prediction. So they all start from 1. And as the disorders increase, the prediction gets better. That is simply because the more the disorder, the more there are to learn from the precursor events. And if it is not disordered at all, then there will be an abrupt jump. So by decreasing disorder, at some point you see that there is no better prediction than this line. With system size, there is a small variation, and with system size, it actually gets worse, unfortunately. And I will try to explain with the remaining 3 minutes that why that is so. So as I said in the beginning, that there are simple generic models that can sort of capture the, at least the hope is that they can capture the failure processes in disordered solids. So this is one of them, the random fuse model. So you have two conductors and there are random fuses, random in the sense that they have different failure thresholds. So as you ramp up your voltage, there are failures happening here and there. And at some point there could be a fracture-like thing. So the stress field in disordered solids are mimicked by the electrical field here. There is an unfortunate notation. So beta is the disorder strength, and the disorder increases downwards, and this is 1 over L. So this is the system size increases this way. And then there are several modes of failure. So one is nucleation. So basically there are some random failures, but just eventually one surface that breaks. There is avalanches. So there are random failures here and there, but eventually there is a nucleation, but percolation is just random failure. But this is not fully, this is not exactly random percolation, but something similar. So you see that if you are here, for example, you are in a percolation failure, so you have a lot of events, lots of precursory events. But if you increase the system size, you eventually end up in this nucleation regime. So your prediction is supposed to get worse. And even for higher disorder, if you are here, you have a rather bad prediction. But if you could increase your disorder, you could end up in percolation, where essentially this clusters averages over the various details, and therefore you could have a better prediction. A similar thing happens in what is called the fiber bundle model. So this is a bunch of fibers that are pulled apart, and again you see various fracture modes depending upon your disorder strength and the interaction range. So interaction range is if there is a failure, how much of the neighborhood is disturbed. You could come up with various phases, and depending upon where you are in your disorder strength and interaction range, you could have a percolation mode or a nucleation mode or a brittle mode. And again, you see that increase of disorder brings you from this brittle to the percolation mode, so the betterment of your prediction. So these are, so what we see, this roughly the ideas are similar. What is predicted from these models are what we also see in the case of the prediction through machine learning. Let's just skip this. And just finally, that there are, of course, many other ways to predict this imminent failure, in this, particularly in case of the script rupture systems. So one such thing is this U-shaped curve in the strain rate. So if you plot strain rate with time, you have an U-shaped curve. And the minimum of that curve is supposed to have a linear relation with the failure point. So for a sufficiently simple model, you could analytically show that. But for a sufficiently complicated model, you can't, but you still have this linear relation. And you could just say that once we reach the minimum, we know that where the failure point would be. But the problem there is one, that you cannot make any prediction until you reach the minimum. So your prediction is pretty lousy up to the point that you reach the minimum. And the second is, once you reach the minimum, your prediction cannot get any better. So these are the comparisons with this sort of prediction and machine learning generally does significantly better. So this is the summary. Well, the future direction is to predict with experimental data, because we have used thousands, tens of thousands of samples for training, which is not possible in case of experiments. So that's the idea. So yeah, I would stop here with the acknowledgement. I have done this work with Michael, but the other people I have, Parangaman is in the audience. I have learned this fracture and their various models and several funding agencies. And thank you for your patience.